Politics at the CUNY Grad Center. And I'm really thrilled to be welcoming you to this evening's lecture by Christina Heatherton. And before I do a proper introduction for Christina, I really want to start by doing two things. One is thanking the staff. We have Juan in the booth, and David, Belen, Rita, Leanne, Mary. You see them all working very hard to make sure that we can do this free public programming. So I wonder if you could join me in thanking them first. We have an amazing team, and we're really, I'm lucky to be working with them. And tonight's event is a part of a lecture series that I'm happy to be hosting here called Interpreting the Crisis. I just want to take you through a few of those and maybe mark your calendars for some of the upcoming things that will be happening. This is, it's going to move in the right direction. We've already done these. We're going to go to the next one. So on March 20th, we have a lecture by Andrew Zimmerman on crisis, reaction, revolution, and emancipation. What activists in the 2020s can learn from the struggle against slavery in the 1850s? I really encourage you to come. Andrew Zimmerman's a historian. We had him before. He edited an important volume of Marx and Engels' writings on the Civil War in the US. We have a book talk by Mary Louise Patterson about her edited volume, Letters from Langston. And those letters from Langston Hughes were to her parents, who are luminaries on the left, William Patterson, Louise Thompson Patterson. And she will be joined by Louis Messiah, who is a filmmaker in Philadelphia. He did a number of important films, including W.B. Du Bois, a biography in 4 Voices, as well as a documentary on Louise Thompson Patterson that we'll be screening that evening. So that's on April 11th at 6:30. I hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. On April 15th, we have a lecture by Sam Stein, who's a graduate student in geography at the Grad Center on labor, land use, and the luxury city. And so we'll get a look at the political economy of the place, literally that we hold this space within, and we would encourage you to attend that as well. And we also have a lecture by the kind of legendary Julius Scott. He had a very important dissertation that was kind of underground for 25 years, and it's called The Common Wind, Afro-American Currents in the Age of the Haitian Revolution. And he'll be joined by the historian Marcus Rudiker, who wrote the foreword for the volume. So again, that's May 14th at 6:30. And last, but you can find out all of this on the website, Interpreting the Crisis, and there's a lot of other classes and events that you can locate there. So last but not least, I'm really delighted and even a little nervous to introduce this evening's speaker, Christina Heatherton. I first met Christina in the fall of 2008. Actually, it's funny, talking about one of our shared mentors, Ruthie Gilmore's book in a seminar, and we've been working together since. She is my colleague, my collaborator, and a partner in life and in crime. It's really an honor to host her for the TPF lecture series. We've been looking forward to this event for some time for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that we have Elizabeth Catlett art space and printmaking studio downstairs. How many of you seen it? Some of you? Okay. One friend has, the name of which was inspired by Christina's research and is run by our colleague Reynaldo Garcia Pantaleon, who is in the back, is just coming from a class where he's instructed. I think 50, 60 students have come through Reynaldo's classes since we launched. It has courses on screen printing, on relief printmaking, and in this way continues the tradition of Elizabeth Catlett and her colleagues in the Taller Gràfica de Popular, the workshop for popular graphic art, which we'll learn about from Christina tonight, which she joined after moving to Mexico. And we're very happy that Reynaldo and many of his students are here this evening, so welcome. Christina is an assistant professor of American Studies at Barnard College, the co-director with Manu Karuga, who's here, and myself of the Racial Capitalism Working Group at Columbia. And she's also the co-editor of Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter, and the author of the forthcoming book, Making Internationalism, The Color Line, the Class Struggle, and the Mexican Revolution, which will appear with the University of California Press. She's been published in a lot of places: Feminists Rethink the Neoliberal State, Futures of Black Radicalism, The Rising Tide of Colors, as well as other influential volumes. Her work is forthcoming in the Cambridge History of America and the World. So perhaps most importantly, Christina is a people's scholar and committed to elevating the voices of the working class movement in North America and the world. A dear friend of TPF and the people's movements. We're honored to have her here tonight. The title is How to Make a Dress. So without further ado, Christina Heatherton.
Okay, hello, hello. Is that still working? All right, good evening. Oh my goodness, thank you all so much for coming. How you guys all doing? Okay, all right. I came in really confident, and then you could see this has been like Christina Heatherton, this is your life. I'm very emotional, so I need your love and energy. I am so excited. I have to say, this is such an honor to present my work at TPF. I've been haunting this place since it opened, but I've never given a talk. So I am excited, a little nervous. This place has been such a refuge for me in the city. If this is your first time here, I hope it can be a refuge for you too. And I've been really proud to work here alongside some of the bravest, most brilliant, and most committed people I've ever encountered. As Jordan said, TPF exists because of the amazing patience and the daily work of people like Claudia, Rita, David, Juan, Belkis, Leanne, Belen, Frisley, Mary, Andy, Vincent, and many others. They are amazing. I hope you get to know them. And maybe you can even help them stack chairs at the end of the night if you're able to do so. I'm sure they'd appreciate that. I want to give special thanks to my teacher, Reynaldo, and my classmates in the relief printing class, which, as Jordan said, was held in the Elizabeth Catlett studio downstairs. He told the class to come and learn who Elizabeth Catlett is, so I feel a little bit like I'm teaching detention up here. If you have a chance to take a class with him or with any of the other incredible teachers here, I highly encourage it. There are not too many places in the whole world where you can learn from some of the greatest artists, organizers, or intellectuals for free, including my colleagues Jordan Kemp and Manu Karuga. So if you have the chance, do it. Tonight I'm going to be talking about Elizabeth Catlett. By the way, how many of you know who she is? Oh, shit. Okay, great. All right, I'm wonderful. So I'm going to discuss the connections between her politics, her radical pedagogy, and the revolutionary spaces that produced her and that she in turn produced. So it's very fitting to be doing it here at TPF. So thanks again. All right, so you know Elizabeth, well, most of you said you did know who she was, but you know Elizabeth Catlett, the Dean of Black Women Artists, even if you don't realize that you know her. In art historian Melanie Herzog's words, she was one of the most important American artists of the past century. Internationally acclaimed for her graphic prints and signature sculptures, she created a body of work that was charged with rage, beauty, life, and struggle. Walking into the homes of older activists, you're likely to encounter her works of art there. In memoirs, the children of radicals describe growing up and running their fingers along the soft contours of their sculptures in comfort and amazement. And in these ways, I think Elizabeth Catlett's work provides some of the ambient texture to radical history in the United States. Most of you are familiar with her widely produced sharecropper lithograph, as well as her Black Power era prints. Her works celebrate Black women, motherhood, collectivity, while also talking about state repression. In works like Target, which was a tribute to Black Panthers Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, murdered by the Chicago Police Department, and in others like the, well, this one, Untitled, And this one that I'm particularly drawn to, The Torture of Mothers, which was made out after the 1964 police beating of black children in Harlem, she calls attention to racist police violence. And it's very important to know that her work was consciously made in dialogue with political struggle, both nationally as well as internationally. In Defense of Latin America is a piece that she reworked throughout the Cold War. In the final version, which was a little blurry, so I tried to pull some of the elements out, she condemns the 1973 US-backed coup in Chile, and she focuses on a soldier blinding a protester. I think a really poignant image that resonates with current Chilean protests against neoliberalism and similar military tactics of blinding. A lot of you have seen the protest being a hand over the eye. But I want to point your attention to some other elements. There are hands at the top of the panel that appear over here. These hands are in honor of Victor Jara, beloved singer and guitar player whose fingers were broken and cruelly mangled before he was executed in front of a horrified stadium of people. But the hands here are also many and joyful, and they wave together. Catlett's images evoke pain, fear, joy, and resilience. I have given the world my song, she says in one of my favorite. To consider Elizabeth Catlett, then, is to behold a beloved artist whose work seems to be everywhere, but whose story is hiding in plain sight. Catlett, unfortunately, is mostly mentioned in relation to her one-time husband, Charles White, another artist of great prominence. I've actually gone through, when I was editing this downstairs, and cut his name out of a lot of the paper. So he's in the story. If you want to talk about Charles White, we can, but this is about Elizabeth Catlett. Catlett's name is peppered through histories of the black left in the 30s and 40s. If she is referenced on her own, it's mostly as a friend or fellow traveler of other self-declared radicals. Biographies and scholarly texts often downplay or minimize Catlett's politics, and this is in no small part due to an image that Catlett cultivated herself within a Cold War context, one her biographers conceivably respected since the viability of her professional career was likely contingent on this professional distance. And we can understand that Catlett was careful in this public performance to keep her cards close, especially if we consider Darlene Clark Hines' concept of dissemblance, the appearance of openness which shields black women, particularly in public life, from scrutiny. As Mary Helen Washington describes in The Other Blacklist, this biographical performance was sometimes necessary for the survival of black artists organizing on the left in Cold War America, namely Elizabeth Catlett. By the time Catlett had her first solo show in Harlem in 1971, she had been effectively shut out of the US market for decades. For most of her life, she lived and worked in Mexico, which, as Simone Brown reminds us, is also home to the oldest FBI field office in the world. And Catlett had long been on the FBI's watch list. After marrying her husband, Francisco Mora, and becoming a Mexican citizen, she was repeatedly denied a visa to enter the US. So this meant she couldn't return for conferences, she couldn't return for gallery shows. Even when her mother was dying, she was refused entry into the country. Like Paul Robeson before her, she had to call in to deliver talks over the phone when she could not do so in person. And by the time her friends organized to get her back into the country, she had suffered, like Robeson, severe setbacks to her career and livelihood, as Rebecca Schreiber describes. So perhaps we can sympathize with some of her reticence to be completely open about her politics. But, as Mary Helen Washington suggests, it might now be time to think anew about Catlett. Who was this person that the FBI watched so closely? What did she do to incur this level of surveillance? Why was she deemed an enemy of the US state? And what motivated her very political artwork? In the words of Catlett's longtime friend, Dr. Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, it is time to tell the truth about this exceptional artist, teacher, and organizer. At the height of the Red Scare, Catlett was classed as an undesirable alien by the State Department and held in a Mexican jail for several days. 2 years later, she renounced her US citizenship. Under the Immigration and Nationality Act, the US government could refuse entry to any person perceived to be a communist, and this, as her FBI file demonstrates, is what she was suspected of being. While few studies have been written about her politics, we can ascertain her history in other ways. Her name surfaces in biographies of radicals who sought refuge in Mexico in this post-war era. When Marvin X, teacher of Huey Newton and co-founder of the Black Arts Theater, was escaping persecution from California's then Governor Ronald Reagan, he found shelter with Catlett in Mexico City. At the time, Catlett was working on this print honoring the Panthers, and as she said to Marvin X, Mexico has always given refuge to revolutionaries around the world. When I interviewed her in Cuernavaca in 2011, she and her son recounted stories of other radicals who had passed through, like Harry Haywood, and she told this very cute story about how he caused a blackout in a small Mexican inn because he thought the lights were too dim, and he had brought all these books with him, so he screwed in this extra bright light bulb, and then the whole place lost power. Very cute. So his books like Diana Anhalt's Gathering of Fugitives and Schreiber's Cold War Exiles in Mexico detail, Catlett assisted a number of figures, those escaping McCarthyism and the blacklist, Spanish refugees fleeing Franco's fascism, Black radicals fleeing US state repression, among others. As she noted in a 1975 interview with Raquel Tibol, quote, "The revolutionary atmosphere in which I developed in Mexico was determinant in my development and projection." Today's presentation comes from a book I'm writing called Making Internationalism, The Color Line, the Class Struggle, and the Mexican Revolution. This is not the cover, it's just the kind of placeholder. I think it's a nice picture. The book follows the internationalization of US capital in the early 20th century and traces the concurrent history of radicals who sought clarity on the specific intersection of the color line and the class struggle. It explores how artists, writers, and other revolutionaries developed an emergent form of anti-racist internationalism. And it observes how they theorized, dramatized, and challenged the racist and gendered social relations under capitalism and consequently developed new articulations of struggle. It argues that their international visions provided a revolutionary alternative to the politics promoted by US imperialism, and following their lead, it foregrounds the influence of the Mexican Revolution, the first major social revolution of the 20th century. So the book is organized around what I call convergence spaces. This is not a depiction of a convergence space, also just a nice placeholder. Convergence spaces are socio-spatial sites where multiple radical traditions were compressed together in struggle. Today I want to look at a few of the convergence spaces that were critical to Catlett's formation for the first 30 years of her life. I'll briefly discuss the Chicago Southside Community Arts Center, the George Washington Carver School in Harlem, and finally the Taller de Gràfica Popular, or the TGP, an internationalist art collective in Mexico City. I think recovering the life of Elizabeth Catlett through these convergent spaces helps us understand not just an overlooked biography, but a submerged theory of internationalism that I think is absolutely critical for our present moment, especially as we are continually confronting violent, racist, sexist, nationalist projects. In her artwork, her thinking, and her teaching, Catlett placed Black working class women, particularly domestic workers, at the heart of the global anti-imperialist class struggle. So by examining her life up until the time she went to Mexico, and by situating her within the radical milieus that produced her, that she in turn produced, I argue that we can more fully comprehend the radical anti-racist feminist internationalist politics of her work. In doing so, we follow Tiffany Ruby Patterson Meyer's injunction to, quote, bring the gendered and class contours of internationalism out of the shadows. Okay, so where shall we begin? There are, oh, I missed a slide. This is her FBI file, which I just found. Really fascinating, very fascinating, and also very typically sexist, which we can talk about. This is, don't get me off on a sidetrack. If any of you want to hear about my thoughts of her FBI file, we can talk about it afterwards. So, but let's start here. We could possibly begin Catletts' story, Catletts' young life as she came of age in Jim Crow, DC, as Paula Austin describes. As a student at Dunbar High School in the early 30s, she was arrested for protesting lynching in front of the Supreme Court with a noose around her neck. Her mom had to come and bail her out. In Catlett's words, quote, I was radical since I was young. We could also begin a few years later when she was a disillusioned undergraduate at Howard University, where she first began studying art. There she befriended a young communist named Pauline Myers, a boarder who was renting a room in her mother's house. Myers was a firebrand speaker at anti-war and anti-fascist demonstrations. She taught Catlett about Marxism and anti-colonialism, things Catlett said in a 1983 oral history that she, quote, never learned about in school. Myers also brought friends to the house, including a number of African socialists, one of whom would kneel at Catlett's grandmother's feet and say, quote, "I'm sitting at your feet, grandmother, tell me about slavery." And Catlett's grandmother had lived through slavery, and this was the first time Catlett had ever heard those stories. So through these experiences, Catlett came to understand her education broadly, encompassing radical theory, her family's own history, as well as the world at war around her. We might also start in Durham, North Carolina, where Catlett got her first teaching job and learned pedagogy and protest at the same time. Here, during the Depression, she was horrified to see how working-class black students, especially girls, were being cheated out of their education, mostly trained to make socks for a nearby factory. Catlett helped organize a campaign to address pay discrepancies between black teachers and white. And in doing so, she learned the dynamics of what she called, quote, black monopoly capitalism. While attuned to anti-black racism, she came to understand the various class structures within Durham's black community. And she saw how local black capitalists and bankers utilized bribes, withheld loans, and deployed gendered coercion to discipline the local population into acquiescing to the reigning order. "I learned a lot in Durham," she said. Catlett escaped to study art at the University of Iowa because there was no out-of-state tuition. She began working with Grant Wood, a painter of the iconic American Gothic. Wood was famous for painting the rural Iowa landscapes that he knew so well, and he encouraged his student Catlett to depict what she best understood. So she began painting and later sculpting working-class black women, particularly black domestic workers in uniform and black mothers. This was perhaps a tribute to her own mother, who had taken on many jobs, including as a seamstress, a truant officer, and later a domestic worker to provide for Catlett, her siblings, and her grandmother. It was also possibly in recognition of the local black women in Iowa among whom she lived and socialized. They helped her find odd jobs, housing, and food when she could not afford it. She won an illustrious prize for her thesis sculpture, Mother and Child, carved in limestone. And when she graduated in 1939, Catlett became one of the first people ever to earn an MFA in fine arts and the first black woman at the University of Iowa to do so. If we had more time, I'm going to tell this woman's whole life, okay. But if we had more time, we could discuss Catlett's job at Prairie View College near Houston, Texas, and its particular racism. There, Catlett first encountered buildings that had 3 separate entrances. There were the main entrance for white people, there were doors on the side marked coloreds, and doors on the other side marked Mexicans. Catlett describes this Texas segregation as a revelation. And in each of these experiences, Catlett came to develop a sense that teaching meant making political decisions about the world one lived in and the world one chose or chose not to reproduce. As an art professor at Dillard College, a historically black college in New Orleans, Catlett developed a reputation as a local firebrand. She lived at 426 Dauphine in the French Quarter and talked about looking at the azaleas bloom on Canal Street. She lived among very poor white families, black and white sex workers, and a staggering white countess who she said looked, quote, like something out of a streetcar named Desire, which I had to quote. Only her new colleague, St. Clair Drake, would visit her. Drake came by after several black Dillard students were arrested. They were falsely accused of removing the signs that demarcated the segregated sections on a bus. Such signs at this period were constantly being removed by people in the city, including Catlett herself, who was fondly remembered in a number of different memoirs for routinely tearing down these signs and throwing them on the ground and telling the bus driver to do his own dirty work. So when these students were arrested, Catlett contacted Raymond Tillman, who was part of a Marxist group that she was in at the time. Tillman was a local NAACP secretary and head of the transport union, and he agreed to represent the students for free. The case was then quietly resolved since the chair of Dillard's board of directors was also the chief stockholder in the bus company. In 1941, Catlett, and this is a famous story that gets told about her a lot, famously desegregated the local Delgado Art Museum. The museum wasn't segregated, but it was inside a park that was. So Catlett had a bus drive 160 black students from Dillard to the front door of the museum. And the experience was formative for her students, many of whom had never been inside an art museum, even though they were at Dillard to study art. Some, like Samela Lewis, Catlett's one-time student who became her friend and biographer, would credit her own journey to becoming an artist as beginning that day. And recently I spoke to famed New Orleans artist Willie Birch, who grew up in the city a few generations later, but he describes how this act continued to reverberate for young people growing up in New Orleans for generations. Students stayed at the Delgado Museum for hours, amazed to see the art, and studying in particular Picasso's famous 1937 mural, Guernica. I want to stop here for a second. Get some water. But I want to stop here for a second with Guernica just to emphasize that Catlett's political development was forged within the struggles against racism and fascism, a struggle that was being keenly fought out in visual art and representation. Guernica depicted the fascist firebombing of a Basque town, a 3-hour ordeal where Nazi and Spanish fascist planes rained down tons of incendiary bombs on the people who were living in this anti-fascist stronghold. This brazen act of civilian slaughter through new war technologies was a prelude to the systematized mass murder that was to come. When the London Times reported on the attack, William Land described the air raid using a phrase that would come to dominate the lexicon of 21st century war. He said it was an act of weapons of mass destruction. A replica of Guernica still hangs in the chamber of the UN Security Council, and as many of you know, in 2003, when Colin Powell presented the authorization for the war on terror, falsely arguing that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, the replica of Guernica was covered with a blue tarp, a move, the UN spokesman said, that was meant to, quote, avert a diplomatic incident. Catlett once described Guernica in a scathing response to a scholar who called the so-called revolutionary art a meaningless description. In the Mexican paper El Dia, Catlett wrote, quote, "Who would dare scorn the genius of Picasso, moved to shout his anger against inhumanity in the mural of Guernica? This tendency is evidence of the intentions to neutralize and control the power of art, to deny art one of its most sacred functions and artists one of their greatest responsibilities, to hold up the mirror of truth and reveal to the eyes of humanity the repulsive presence of the exploitation of man by man." In this early 1940s period, the struggle against racism and fascism, particularly in the black left, was led by women, as Catlett would learn from women like Margaret Goss Burroughs when she moved to Chicago. Burroughs introduced Catlett to the Southside Community Art Center, the SSCAC, which she directed. And these are some really fantastic images, some by Jack Delgado, that are at the Library of Congress. So you can see some of the classrooms and exhibit spaces of this fantastic community center, which I wish I had more time to talk about, but I decided to tell this woman's biography in like 40 minutes, so you have to bear with me. But so while Catlett had advanced training, you know, she had this MFA from the University of Iowa, the SSCAC offered her something new. Here, politics and culture converged with rigor, joy, and with intention. Here she entered a world that would profoundly shape her consciousness about art and its relationship to radical internationalist politics. Like the Harlem Renaissance, Chicago's artists, intellectuals, and organizers were part of a vibrant intellectual and political culture, as authors like Brian Dolliner, Bill Muller, Stacey Morgan, Miriam Kaba, and others have described. During the so-called Chicago Renaissance, figures like writer Richard Wright, dancer Katherine Dunham, poet Gwendolyn Brooks, photographer Gordon Parks, scholar Horace Caden, and organizers like Harry Haywood flourished. Many were able to cultivate their talents independently or through the alliance of labor and civil rights organizations known as the National Negro Congress, or the NNC, as well as through the Communist Party-affiliated John Reed clubs. Black artists in the scene connected local struggles against racism and poverty to the global fight against colonialism, imperialism, and fascism, particularly the Spanish Civil War. After returning from Spain, Harry Haywood helped to organize a large anti-fascist peace mobilization, 20,000 marchers strong. Through these relationships, participants in Chicago's cultural scene connected local struggles to a global context, developing support for the global fight against fascism, to support of the Mexican, Nicaraguan, and Haitian people's fight against US imperialism that was happening at the time. So, you know, I had an alternative opening to this talk that was just about Chicago. The stories of how they fundraised for this space are incredible. They had these lavish costume balls. Very poignantly, actually, Elizabeth Catlett won first prize where she had to dress as Mexico itself, and there's this beautiful story where she didn't have a dress, and she has to take these curtains off of her friend's home, and you know, it's a beautiful story. I don't have time to tell it, but the story of how this space came together is really beautiful. In one fundraiser, over $20,000 in donations was collected from a cross-side of Southside, the Southside community, from its teachers, its artists, its gamblers, its sex workers, as well as its white uptown gallery owners. At the opening of the center, artist David Ross said, quote, "Here was our chance to stop shining shoes all week and painting only on Sundays. This gave us a means of learning as well as earning our living as artists. With free art classes, exhibition space, as well as a place for artists to discuss and develop their own work, the Southside Community Art Center was tremendous for the community, and Catlett's time here was absolutely formative. It was here that she met Charles White, and as she very flatly suggested, quote, theoretically, we fell in love." You have to get the full beat of that, but very flatly. So, okay, so there are, like I said, a lot of places we can start. But where I actually want to begin, we haven't actually begun, where I actually want to begin is a place very similar to the space that we're in now, in a location not too far from where we're sitting in New York City. And I actually want to start with a song. A song. Let's see if I can get it. Okay, if this were a fancier presentation, I would just kind of fade that out, but let's just pretend that happened. All right, Catlett describes the scene this way. 1944. About 350 of us were squeezed into a small room on a hot June night with the windows closed and the shades drawn because of the World War II blackout. It was uncomfortable. We were listening to Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, which we're listening to now. Oh, it's fading out. Oh, so dramatic. Dmitri Shostakovich's symphony, titled Leningrad, was written during the devastating Nazi siege of his hometown in 1941. The symphony had been smuggled out of Russia by a US agent on microfilm. It was flown to Tehran. It was driven through the Middle East and into Cairo, where it was then flown to Brazil and then to DC, where an agent almost lost it when he forgot it on a lunch tray, but he recovered it just before the waiter threw it away. After this music was transcribed and performed by musicians in New York, it was broadcast across the country, offering people in the US an intimate vision of the brutal Nazi assault. In that siege, over 1 million people were cut off from food, heat, or contact with the outside world. Many of the musicians who originally performed it in Russia regularly fainted from hunger and even died during rehearsal. When it was performed in Leningrad, the symphony was said to be so powerful that when it was broadcast over loudspeakers, even the Nazi soldiers took heart. Years later, one Nazi remarked on the, quote, slow but powerful effect the symphony had. He said, "We began to see that there was something stronger than starvation, fear, and death, the will to stay human." According to M.T. Anderson, the song marked a decisive turn in the siege and in the war, and its power was not lost on American audiences in the United States. So this was what Catlett and others had packed into the room to listen to on this hot June night, which is kind of hard to create. We're in this perfectly air-conditioned room, but can you imagine it, right? 350 people. As she recalled, a professor from Dillard's School of Music had come to play this song for our students, who were mostly Harlem's people, janitors, day workers, laundresses, cooks, elevator operators, and so on, poor black people who served others. In the middle of this symphony, right, just a little farther from where I played, the professor stopped the record. Said Catlett, "When the first movement ended, the professor explained that since the second movement was very long, we could all take a break to refresh ourselves with some cold punch." The students politely refused. They said, "No, the break can wait. We want to hear it." And they said this all together. Now, ignorant me, I had thought that they weren't interested in classical music, said Catlett. So I bring this up because Catlett tells this interview in many interviews, many times over, to illustrate what she described in 1996 as a new awareness of a tremendous hunger for culture, she called it. This hunger, she said in a 2002 New York Times interview, made me realize that artists should create art for everyone, not just an elite. The students she encountered in Harlem were the domestic workers, this is her quote, the people that worked in the dress trades, people that served other people. Their interest and their desire to learn about literature and art and economics and history and so forth was great. That is the big experience of my life, she told Kersha James in 1994. The main method of denial, she explained in 1999, was then and continues to be the fostering of an elitist art, which further widens class distinction. Her experience teaching in Harlem then, she told Stephanie Stokes Oliver in 1998, made her realize that I had to work for the people. Up until then, I guess, I didn't have any artist philosophy about what I was doing or why. So I want to turn now and talk a little bit about her time teaching in Harlem at the George Washington Carver School, where she had these revelations. So let me say this. When we think about popular education, which is something that people at TPF talk a lot about, we often think of the advances made by people like Paulo Freire with Pedagogy of the Oppressed, or perhaps the freedom schools that were created during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. But as historians like Marvin Gettleman and education scholar Jonathan Hunt have argued, these common narratives of popular education obscure the foundational work that was done from the 1920s on. Between 1923 and 1957, possibly the largest system of adult education in America, according to Gettleman, was a network of adult education schools organized by labor unions and the Communist Party. These were the functional equivalent of a university for the working class who could both learn a vocation and, in the words of Richard Flax, enter the world of ideas even if they were kept out of formal elite institutions of higher learning. In the cultural front, Michael Denning quotes a Croatian immigrant whose name I'm going to butcher, I'm going to try my best, named Stephen, who was, as he described, foreign-born and poorly educated, like most of the students who passed through these schools. Said Stephen, the radical movement was our teacher. It was a great step forward to be drawn together in a group, to talk and listen, to be induced to read and study. Where else could we get that opportunity? During World War II, this network of schools vastly expanded. In this popular front era, which emphasized national unity against fascism, schools drew on a nationalist patriotic culture. Boston Schools was called the Samuel Adams School. Chicago was named after Abraham Lincoln, and Philadelphia's for Tom Paine. In New York, as Denise Lynn has recently described, the main school was the Jefferson School over at 575 6th Avenue. In the Jefferson School's first publication, its classes and forums were described as, quote, mass weapons as sharp and decisive as bullets in the struggle against fascism. That's a hell of a course catalog. Okay, but in 1944, Catlett joined the staff of the George Washington Carver School, which was also known as a People's Institute at 57 West 125th Street in Harlem between 7th and 8th Avenue. So if other schools were named after so-called American heroes, Harlem's was of course named after George Washington Carver, a black agronomist and botanist who made extraordinary advances in soil cultivation after Reconstruction. And while he's mostly known, most insultingly known, for having something to do with peanut butter, he actually developed the farming methods to introduce crops with high protein content that not only nourished communities, but also replenished soil that had been stripped and depleted by excessive cotton cultivation. His findings allowed new worlds to grow out of brutal grounds. So I think it's a beautiful name for a school, Washington Carver School. The Carver School was a product of the NNC and drew heavily from the ranks of organized workers, the longshoremen, the Marine Cooks and Stewards Union, which historian Alan Barrow-Bay describes as having their own radical anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-homophobic politics in the 30s and 40s. Their slogan was no red baiting, no race baiting, no queen baiting, since members knew that if they could be divided along any of these lines, they could be defeated. The Carver School tied them to the space of Harlem. Board members like Ben Davis, Harlem's communist councilman, was active in supporting black left institutions. Others like Du Bois and Paul Robeson were simultaneously on the board and part of the Council on African Affairs, an organization that worked in solidarity with African struggles against colonialism and apartheid. William Patterson, head of the International Labor Defense, was one of many members who also worked with the Civil Rights Congress and the global campaign to free the Scottsboro Boys. So Catlett describes moving between spaces and thinking about Harlem, about police violence, about the poverty and debt of its residents, about the gendered vulnerability they all experienced in the context of global anti-fascist and anti-colonial struggle. But World War II also had these really extraordinary unintended consequences of enhancing women's leadership, especially in the black left and particularly in Harlem. As Eric Gettleman writes in Death Blow to Jim Crow, in the period, a quote, younger group of black women took over much of the NNC's operations in New York City. So to tell the story of the Harlem left is to talk about a world where Mary Louise Patterson, Esther Cooper Jackson, Claudia Jones, Marvell Cook, Augusta Savage, who actually ran this fantastic salon with Mary Louise Patterson, and Eslanda Robeson, to name a few, were all in decisive leadership positions. So adding to the already excellent studies by historians like Dale Gore, Barbara Ransby, Carol Boyce Davies, Cheryl Higashida, Keith Gilliard, among others, I really think Catlett should be elevated to the ranks of these leaders, as well as her friend, director of the Carver School, Gwendolyn Bennett. At the moment, Bennett's story can be found largely through her FBI files, and I talk about this a little bit more in the broader chapter. Like Margaret Goss Burroughs, who was the Southside Community Arts Center director in Chicago, there's a lot to say about Bennett and how her relationship with Catlett was a critical component of radicalizing them both. Okay, so add that to the list of things I'm not going to talk about. So moving on. I want to say a few more things about Catlett in Harlem, especially because so little is written about her work in New York. In oral histories, Catlett describes being a staff illustrator for the NNC newsletter. But the archives show that Catlett provided much more than illustration, particularly in her correspondences with W.B. Du Bois. In one note, she writes, in her capacity as executive secretary of an art initiative in Detroit, organized by the NNC and New Masses, she asked Du Bois to serve as co-chair to, quote, combat the campaign of racial antagonism that is being carried on in Detroit by followers of Gerald L.K. Smith and other American firsters. And if you don't know about the US-based fascist movement of the American firsters, I encourage you to learn and, find the unsurprising roots of a lot of the struggles we're up against now. Catlett was a shrewd writer in her own right. And this could be seen, for example, in a really great article she writes for the New Masses. In 1946, the Brooklyn Museum had an exhibit which they called, quote, "The Negro Artist Comes of Age." Catlett wrote a review which begins, well, it doesn't begin, but it's in the middle. The title in itself is an insult, which it was. Exactly. She says, "Black artists have contributed to American culture since the late 19th century, the late 18th century. Had the museum had the consciousness about style or form, they wouldn't have just grouped all these black artists together with nothing uniting them except for the fact that they were black." So this is 1946. She writes this fantastic overview. Catlett also worked in other very public capacities, at one point speaking alongside Communist Party leader William Z. Foster at a conference called Art as a Weapon. And she received a lot of criticism for this appearance. And she joked, quote, "So there I was." I wish I could just play this for you, but I'm gonna have to read this. "So there I was, working in a Red Front school and speaking on a program with William Z. Foster. Also, I worked with the Committee for the National Negro Congress. That made me a communist 3 times. But once, you know, Dr. Du Bois said, if you take one step backwards, you never stop running. So I decided not to take that step back." In the ferment of Harlem in the 1940s, whereas Harold Cruz described, nobody gave a damn who you were or what your politics were, debates raged between communists, black nationalists, anti-communists, and liberals at places like the YMCA. Cruz, who would of course later become a fierce anti-communist, said at the time, anybody that couldn't argue Marx or Engels was considered a goddamn dummy. Cruz took his first class with Du Bois at the Carver School and then says really adorably in this interview he couldn't figure out why Du Bois never had any time for him. He also took a class on philosophy by Howard Selsom, who was a former professor at Brooklyn College for 10 years. Selsom had been dismissed by the local New York Rap Cordert investigation, which purged suspected leftists from their teaching jobs. Many of the teachers at Carver were victims of this early Red Scare hysteria, this unfounded assault on public education, as Ellen Schrecker has powerfully documented. Usually it was the students who were more radical on campus than their teachers. And there are these stories of radical students who only learned that their teachers were on the left when they read that they had been killed while fighting in Spain. As one substitute teacher who eventually joined the party described, if you were drawn to the people who worked the hardest to change things for students, you inevitably found yourself with the communists. They were the ones who looked out for their coworkers, who fought against the exploitation and repression faced by student staff or local neighbors. Mark Starr, who was avowedly not a communist, but head of worker education for the ILGWU, formed a committee to combat Red Scare attacks on education. Talk of subversive and immoral activities, he wrote, is nothing but a smokescreen behind which the enemies of public education seek to destroy the economic and intellectual foundations of our school system. So we saw the Red Scare as just a smokescreen through which the public good, public education, was being dismantled and destroyed. So while many talented teachers lost their jobs, as a result of the Red Scare, the Carver School gained the benefit of their labor. Initially, Carver students cut a wide swath across Harlem social classes. But after an article by Westbrook Pegler, who Elizabeth Catlett says in this oral history, and I could not forget this monster's name, Westbrook Pegler denounced the school as a red front. Most of the middle class students left. As a result, the students of Carver were the cooks, maids, janitors, elevator operators, garment industry workers, and domestic workers of New York who took courses for $3 each. And the students quickly transformed the place as their own. Young artists painted the originally dreary walls of the school. A volunteering minister rolled up his sleeves and glued together chairs for students to sit on. McCrory's 5 and dime store up the block donated a grand piano. In the first term, 157 people came from trade unions, fraternal organizations, youth groups, and churches. And after 3 years, enrollment rose to 702 students. In a 1946 Chicago Defender article, a student, Catherine Hennant, describes her experience. She says, "I wondered why I was receiving such valuable and capable guidance at so small a fee. How was this possible? I thought about my teacher and why he must have been interested in the problems of the working class, since he used politics to illustrate the meaning and use of the words. I then began to wonder about the other teachers, whether they too were interested in the problem of workers. And I decided that the Carver School must be a school for the fair-thinking people of this community. Why? Because black and white were serving side by side to aid those of us who sought a better understanding of life and its problems. The curriculum was based according to what the students need. Popular classes included a Black history class taught by Elaine Locke and E. Franklin Frazier. Erwin Freundlich of Juilliard taught music appreciation. Dorothy Homer, head librarian at the 135th Street Public Library, held a class on current books and social classes. The head of price control taught a course called Your Dollar and How to Spend It, and students jokingly argued that they would rather have a class called Your Dollar and How to Get It. Classrooms offered students the opportunities to discuss politics as it unfolded in Harlem. As Catlett recounts, quote, some cops shot a soldier in the back in a hotel when LaGuardia was mayor, and the people cleared out of 125th Street and everything. Yeah, well, we analyzed that in the school, why that happened. The most popular class at the Carver School, as the Chicago Defender described, was one called How to Make a Dress. Catlett taught this popular class and recalled common conversations she would have about it when people would ask, how do you teach Marxism making a dress? And I said, well, while we're sewing, we talk. And when a lady says, oh, I have to leave early to get my news, I'd say, well, do you know what the news thinks of you and of black people? And we get into a discussion of why newspapers are printed and who reads them and what they support and what they don't support. And that was the way it worked. In these classes, Catlett would come into the closest contact with black domestic workers in Harlem at the center of the class struggle. The question of black domestic workers had occupied organizing efforts, the writing, the theory of black radical feminists in Harlem in this period. Writers like Alice Childress would go on to devote much of her Freedom Ways column, Conversations from Life, to the lives of black domestic workers. Marxist Claudia Jones would devote a 4-page section of her famous 1949 essay, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, to the domestic worker. Marvell Cook would write a series of articles about their struggle. In 1935, Cook and the young organizer Ella Baker co-authored the article Bronx Slave Market, describing the humiliations of black domestic workers huddled on the street corners in the early morning hours, awaiting inspection from middle-class women for potential labor for the day. Baker and Cook emphasized the role of clothing as critically enabling or preventing employment. It marked ability, social class, levels of desperation, and signaled the forms of labor that its wearer was willing to undertake. Quote, rain or shine, cold or hot, you will find them there, women old and young, bedraggled, sometimes neatly dressed, waiting expectantly. For black domestic workers, dresses were not just objects of fancy, but necessary for confronting the complexities of their employment. Catlett's material engagement helped to elaborate the multiple forms of valorization that were happening through the dress. These articles of clothing were class signifiers, prerequisite for entrance into different spaces and places of employment. Their style, color, and upkeep became unstable markers of employability. They needed to be clean to signal reliability, but also stylish enough to make the wearer a conspicuous object of servitude, able to impress friends and neighbors of the white women who hired them. They were also objects of utility, necessary to clothe the body. They needed to be sturdy, flexible, and durable enough to work in. And as Catlett recounted, it was easier to have navy blue or brown or black that didn't show dirt that much. These were, after all, not costumes, but uniforms. And these dresses also had to be understood as potential liquid assets that could be sold in desperate conditions. During one cold winter in Iowa, Catlett had been forced to sell her own coat in order to afford rent and food. So she understood this relationship well. Critically, these dresses had to subtly convey the wearer's availability or unavailability for sex work. And while it was often wealthy white women who did the hiring, Baker and Cook noted that husbands, sons, brothers, under the subterfuge of work, offer worldly-wise girls higher bids for their times. These scenes underscored the ways in which the complex reality of race, gender, and class victimized black domestic workers and forced them into vulnerable entanglements. Accordingly, clothes, the dresses, had to be complex vectors of communication, aware of the racialized, class, and gendered violence that seethed behind every transaction. So this class, How to Make a Dress, was perhaps one space where the complex politics of Black working class women's daily lives could be untangled. Catlett even describes learning about how clothing reflected her students' housing conditions, since women, quote, didn't have bathrooms, or they shared them with somebody, which also determined how often or whether the dress could be washed or mended. So the class was a unique space within which the complex relations that went into the commodity of the dress, the commodity of the labor power of these women, and an understanding of capital, not as an abstraction, but a practice, a determinate set of social relations where the inseparability of racism, patriarchy, and class could be understood together. But if these dresses signaled the vulnerability of their wearers, they could also become, as Peter Stallybrass had written, the materialization of class resistance. New York City, after all, had the highest rates of unionized Black domestic workers, as Esther Cooper Jackson, future editor of Freedom Ways magazine, described in her 1940s master's thesis. Such organizing was necessary, as Du Bois would argue in Darkwater, quote, as long as domestic service was the rule for Black people, emancipation would always remain a conceptual abstraction. I want to say one other thing that I don't mention here. I don't know why it fell out of this draft, but you know, it wasn't all about labor. It was also about joy. And Catlett has these beautiful stories about, you know, the student who made a just really fierce aquamarine dress, you know, things that were lavish, things that were fun, things that were sexy. So, you know, I'm obviously making a point about why How to Make a Dress was such an important place. You know, why was this the most popular course in Harlem? But I don't want that to go unsaid, the dimensions of life, of love, of desire that also went into the production of these dresses. So in these ways, the Carver School gave Catlett the transformative opportunity to better understand the position of Black working class women in relationship to global struggles for socialism. It also helped her understand how art could be responsive to their lives and political and social movements. So with this in mind, she proposed a series about the lives of Black working class women, and she submitted an application to the Rosenwald Fellowship to go to Mexico. So, okay. How y'all doing? All right, so we went to Durham, we went to DC, we went to Guernica, New Orleans, we went to Harlem, all right, we're gonna go to Mexico, we went to Chicago. Let me drink some water. All right. So while I'm drinking water, have any of you been to the Whitney exhibit about Black and Mexican art in the US? We'll see you all raise your hand about Catlett. I don't feel too guilty now. All right, so there's an exhibit talking about the next thing I'm going to briefly talk about, which is why Mexico. Mexico had been a part of Catlett's consciousness since she began studying art in DC. Her very first job in college was to paint a Diego Rivera-style mural, and really ironically, Catlett said she was fired from that job because she spent her time partying and making dresses. Diego Rivera, perhaps the most famous of all the Mexican muralists, wrote in 1932, quote, "The importance of the artist can be measured directly by the size of the multitudes whose aspirations and whose life he serves to condense and translate." Black artists in the US, particularly since the Depression, had been moved by this intention. They shared with Mexican revolutionary artists a radical anti-racist ethic, a refusal to promote elite interests or its racist aesthetics. And not only were individual Mexican muralists great influences on mural artists in the US, the very inspiration for the WPA, the very inspiration for the federal arts project of the WPA came from Mexico. This national effort reframed artists as cultural workers, and subsidized their work in service to the public. The WPA changed the property relation of art, putting murals in the public possession, as the head of the Federal Arts Project said, making art, quote, the property of all instead of the hobby of the few. Murals hung in public buildings and became public entities that could not be sold to private buyers. It was not uncommon for Black artists to encounter other WPA-funded artists who had been to Mexico, who had studied with Rivera, or with David Alfaro Siqueiros or Jose Clemente Orozco, who are known as Los Tres Grandes. intern Mexican artists came to the US, have you ever wondered why did they, why paint the mural in Rockefeller? Why paint the mural at the Ford Foundation? We have a lot to say about the Ford Foundation. Well, there was a reactionary turn in Mexico in the revolution, and so those forms of subsidies weren't available. So the reason we have such a presence of those Mexican artists in the US was also, so that they could make a living. So for many black artists, Mexico became a mecca where they were able to nurture their radical artistic training. And the influence of these Mexican artists was so strong that Edward Bruce, head of the fine arts in the WPA, vowed to stop the radical content appearing in these murals by, quote, preventing this Mexican invasion on the border. That's a quote. So this influence was very strong in New York. As anybody who lives here knows, there were the murals that never made it, like Rivera's Man at the Crossroads in Rockefeller Center, and the ones that do, Orozco's murals at the New School. I don't have images, unfortunately, of these, but I just want to mention that, of course, both the NAACP and the Communist Party had competing exhibitions on lynching. And both featured Jose Clemente Orozco's really haunting lithograph called Hang Negroes, which was this haunting image of 4 lynched black men being consumed by fire. And art historians have observed the stylistic similarities between Orozco's depictions of lynchings and earlier series that he'd done about violence in the Mexican Revolution. Also participating were artists who had traveled to Mexico, like the Japanese-American artist Isamu Noguchi, who displayed his work in both of the anti-lynching exhibits. And I really wish I had a picture of this, but Noguchi had this haunting sculpture called Death, or a lynched figure. And what he had done is he had taken this photograph of a contorted body that had been lynched and set on fire, that had been circulated by the ILD, and he turned it into a sculpture. So there was all this to say that there was a great consciousness of the Mexican art in New York, and it was in New York that Catlett met members of the Taller de Gràfica Popular, an internationalist art collective, and they invited her to come to Mexico. So I feel like I'm telling you everything I ever known, but I'm going to start wrapping this up. So Catlett received the Rosenwald grant to travel to Mexico and to complete this series on the black women. The TGP is a really interesting formation. They took commissions from labor organizations, student groups, literacy campaigns, and what they would do is they would collectively produce the required symbology together. So in joining the TGP, Catlett was not just exposed to this collective of artists, but this unique style of pedagogy as well. At the end of the day, the artists would affix their works to the walls. Moving slowly as a group, they would stop at each other's drawings and discuss. Sometimes comments revolved around style, other times about purpose and clarity. The artists were firm but encouraging. Catlett recounts, at the Taller, we all worked more or less collectively. Everyone was interested in your project. Each artist would select a theme, go home, do a drawing, then the drawings were brought in and put up so we could see how they related to the assignment. And the criticism was always constructive. I think the symbolism is good, someone might say, but the drawing is weak. To make it stronger, you could improve the way that you drew the hand, which you slurred a little, while you were focusing on the face. I just want to say, I've come back to her descriptions of the kind of pedagogy of TGP a lot, because she says, the way we get trained in formal institutions of higher education is usually in a kind of vapid, overly flattering way. People will tell you all the things you do well, but they don't normally give you the critique to make you better. And so the difference between being a part of this space, where it was a collective objective of the group, changed the nature of that kind of critique. Could the image convey its message? Could it illustrate the specific elements that the striking students, trade unions, or anti-fascist movements had asked the TGP to do? Could it, in turn, communicate its message to the majority of people in Mexico and beyond? When Catlett arrived in Mexico, the TGP artists were in the middle of producing a series on the history of the Mexican Revolution. And this was a series of 85 lino cuts graphically illustrating its history. Catlett was clearly moved by what she saw. She had come to Mexico to produce a print series celebrating the lives of Black working class women, and the series, later titled The Black Women, did just that. So placed together, the titles of these 15 linograph prints can be read as a poem. I am the Black woman. I have always worked hard in America, in the fields, in other folks' homes. I have given the world my songs. In Sojourner Truth, I fought for the rights of women as well as blacks. In Harriet Tubman, Reynaldo, this is the one we all had to study. All right. I helped hundreds to freedom. In Phyllis Wheatley, I proved intellectual equality in midst of slavery. My role has been important in the struggle to organize the unorganized. I have studied in ever-increasing numbers. My reward has been bars between me and the rest of the land. I have special reservations, special houses, and a special fear for my loved ones. My right is a future of equality with other Americans. So the collaboration between Catlett and the TGP is really evident in this series. This is a cover of the Estampas, and this is a cover of the republished the Black Woman series. So when you put the two together, you start to notice the similarities. In the TGP series, Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa are given heroic depictions, while in Catlett's series, famous Black leaders like Sojourner Truth and Phyllis Wheatley are featured. Significantly, both series also celebrate the experiences of ordinary men and women and their lives as workers, musicians, grievers, fighters, and organizers. So placed side by side, the stylistic similarities and political resonance become really apparent. One piece that I think, I happened to come across the Black women while I was looking at these archives in Stanford. I had come to look at the Estampa series and then had to make sense of why there was something called the Black woman in the same box. And I started looking at them, and it was only when I got to this image and realized it looked so much like this image that I realized that there might be a story there. In the TGP series, The Porfirian Dictatorship demagogically exalts the native by Alfredo Zalce. It depicts a scene in the lead up to the revolution, the Mexican Revolution. An indigenous man lays prostrate on the ground while a procession of foreign capitalists parade in the background, seemingly trampling his body. The images reflect actual parades held in Mexico City on the eve of the revolution that were meant to link indigenous history to modern Mexico. And in this procession, indigenous figures were extolled as national symbols. The image highlights the hypocrisy of this act. Throughout the country, the Mexican state tried to claim a pre-Hispanic Indian ancestry for itself, while at the same time it brutally expropriated the land and labor of indigenous Mexican people. In Zalce's image, the exalted indigenous figure is flanked on either side by white men in top hats, the universal symbol for capitalists, holding foreign flags, particularly French flags, representative of the foreign capital interests who were invested in this spectacle. And in Catlett's image, A Special Fear for My Loved Ones, illustrates, I think, a similar scene from a different time and place. The image depicts a Black man who has been lynched, his body on the ground and a noose around his neck. The feet around him appear at first glance to belong to a lynch mob, but it becomes unclear whether his eyes are indicting the figures above him or looking sympathetically at him. Instead of standing above him, the feet surrounding the men, also just kind of given the composition of the image, appear to be floating. This lynch mob could be constructed, alternatively as other men who have also been lynched, but not yet cut down. The feet that appear at the top of this picture are the only visible parts of their bodies. The ambiguity of perspective, I think, alters the tragedy of this image. Catlett's image, read in this way, depicts lynching as an act of terrorism, of racist terrorism, and subordination, one that equally destroys the lives of those acted upon and those committing the acts. Okay, so there's a lot more I can say But let me wrap up. You've been such a sweet, patient audience, so let me wrap up. By way of a conclusion, I want to say this. In 1942, Catlett debated the concept of internationalism with her teacher, Osip Zadkin. She took these private lessons in New York. Zadkin was a Russian-born sculptor who was Jewish. He'd come to New York City after fleeing the Nazis in Paris. So like Picasso's famous depictions of fascism in Guernica or Shostakovich's musical composition against fascism, Osip Zadkin's work was also motivated by a fight against fascism. His modernist sculptures took on themes of suffering, the destruction of cities in war, of universal pain. His artwork, he explained, was necessarily internationalist. In this moment of global crisis and amidst the rise of fascism, he asked Catlett why she insisted on sculpting images of black women and children, a theme he asserted that was limited and decidedly nationalist. And Catlett would have none of it. In a 2002 interview, she recounted how she pushed Zadkin on his definition of internationalism. Why couldn't people identify with the black mother and child the way they might with what he considered the internationalist imagery of the day? What made him assume that her artwork was limited instead of universally identifiable? And why did he presume that his present sculpture of a male poet adorned with a French poem on it was in itself nationalist? So to recover the life and work of Elizabeth Catlett broadens our conception of internationalism and I think allows us into the heart of this urgent question. So again, why internationalism? Around the world, people are confronting violent nationalism, racist, sexist, settler colonial nationalism. From the repression of the Wet'suwet'en in Canada, murderous mobs in India encouraged by the Modi government, street violence in Brazil authorized by Bolsonaro, to white supremacist gangs right here in New York City, emboldened by racist policing, wanton deportations, and detention. And with the escalation of gendered violence in each instance, it's imperative that we think about internationalism and that we recover it in the long history of anti-fascist resistance in this submerged history of Catlett's internationalism. I'll stop there. I'm excited to have a conversation with you. Thank you all for letting me pour that out.
Thanks very much, Christina. I would just ask you if you have questions to speak into the mic because we're live streaming. So. Not everybody at once. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks so much for this lecture. It's amazing. Last year I went to Chicago and there is a museum there in Pilsen called the Mexican-American Museum. And they had this beautiful exhibition about the Taller de Gràfica Popular and her works and the collective works there, and they were on display. It was amazing. And it made me think why we don't see more of this. And my question to you is, are you studying her? Do you have any curatorial inspirations to bring more of her works to the light of the people? I mean, because I see also, it's one work here, one work there. There was the one in the Radical Woman show, that sculpture that you show. But I would like to see in a really prominent space, like her whole works. Any thoughts on that?
Say it to the live stream camera so the people can hear you. I'm available. Yes, no, I mean, it's a fantastic idea. You know, I mean, I completely sympathize, and the more I've been doing the research and just seeing, you know, it's not just her life, but her art that's just kind of picked apart. Like, I think this is part of the reason of developing or recovering a coherent narrative of who she is, because how would you do that show if you only had a partial vision of who she was? Yeah, so let's talk.
Thank you for the terrific lecture, Christina. I was wondering if you could speak to the kind of parts that you didn't speak about, which would be, I assume, like the 50s and kind of the Cold War repression and how Catlett either find sanctuary in Mexico, and what kind of impact did she have, not just in the taller, but in the part of Mexico that she was in? Was there a kind of conviviality in terms of these kinds of intellectual externalities that she was interested in? Was there a continuation of the kind of educación popular that she's also interested in? And I don't know if you could just kind of speak to the 50s and Cold War repression.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to answer your last questions, yes. I mean, she has a huge impact in Mexico, and if I were writing a whole book on her, I probably would talk more specifically about the way that she developed her pedagogy there, because a lot of her former students, they talk about these principles that she developed in the taller. What does it mean to actually do something collectively, or to understand yourself not as an individual artist, but as part of a collective of people and a collective political project, right? But I'm not writing a book about her. This is just the last chapter in a book that actually begins in 1848 and then kind of goes 100 years. You heard that right, University of California, goes 100 years. I wish I were writing that book. I think there is a story to be told. I have heard that some people are now interested in telling her story, but those would be the questions I think to ask and explore. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Just absolutely amazing lecture. Yeah, and this is also a question that maybe is going a little bit further beyond, but I was wondering, in terms of internationalism, you talked a lot about in the context of international anti-fascism, but also both being involved with people like Claudia, and also the Pan-Americanism, but being involved with people, like Claudia Jones in Harlem in the 30s, but then also her involvement with, Black Power in the 50s and 60s. What, if any, elements of anti-colonialism and decolonial thought inspired her, and what, if any, elements of sort of Pan-Africanism, Afro-Caribbean connections might have also been present in her work.
Can you repeat the first part of your question again?
Oh, I guess just also because, when she's expressing solidarity with Black Power, these are movements that are heavily inspired by anti-colonial politics, and there's a lot of anti-colonial politics in Harlem in the 30s. So yeah, what, in addition to anti-fascist internationalism, if there are any elements of anti-colonial internationalism, and then also the Afro-Caribbean Pan-Africanism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's trying to decide if I should just play you a part of her oral history that I have, where she, definitely talks about all of these influences. And I mean, to be clear, in the section where I'm talking about the Council on African Affairs, her relationship to Du Bois and Robeson, Max Yergin, her various entanglements with the National Negro Congress. My point there is to say that she was deeply integrated in these conversations, it's not as if nobody has written about Catlett. They've just kind of written about her in this very peripheral way, right? That she would just kind of happen to pop up at these meetings in Harlem, or that she just happened to do the pictures. And I think when you look through the archives, especially the archives of Du Bois's writings, and you see, that she's in dialogue with these figures, that she's organizing things together, that, I think we have to take her as a much more serious organizer. So, definitely involved in the kind of debates that I'm trying to illustrate. And, undoubtedly, she would go to art conferences, and if there were no Black artists, if there were no Latinx artists, if there were no artists from the Caribbean, she would raise hell, and she would say, so what is this depiction of art? How are you imagining the kind of, what kind of canon are you reproducing here? I think that there were, what am I trying to say? I think I might just repeat what I said before. I think my intention on focusing on this part of her life is just to sort of redress a part of her story that really falls out, which is to say she was deeply involved and invested in a number of these revolutionary spaces where a much more complicated conversation about anti-capitalism, anti-fascism, anti-colonialism were coming together. I think the historiography often combs these out and makes it seem like it can be one or the other, and these are discrete formations. So, I really had to wrestle with this when I kept seeing this story about Shostakovich and all these different, why is she telling this story about Shostakovich? So, just bringing fascism and anti-colonialism and anti-racism into the conversation together, I think, was part of what motivated this.
Got time for one, maybe two more questions? Yes.
Sorry, this one is very specific. I already asked one, so if there's no one. This very specific one. The portfolio that you show, the Negro woman, I noticed that she did a reprint in '89. Do you have any idea of why in that moment she decided to reprint that work?
I don't know why she chose to reprint that particular work, but I think, what's interesting, if I went back to those early prints of, the Black Power movement prints, you actually see a lot of that imagery comes from the Black Woman series in 1946. So, yeah. I mean, like a lot of artists, like a lot of writers, you could call it self-plagiarism. You could just call it, creative reuse. She was definitely adapting images to the image of Chile, right? That's one that she initially does in the 40s. And because U.S. intervention, U.S. imperialism in Latin America becomes this persistent theme, it's something that she's able to bring these elements, sample these elements again and again to produce something new.
Actually, I thought it was very interesting that you made the relationship with the event that happened last week here to collect money for the front lines and all the lost eyes. Yeah.
Going once? Yeah, okay. These are the last two then. Maybe we'll take the two together and then you can respond to both, if that's okay.
Hi, thank you so much. I know that you had used the framework of cultural worker in the talk, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how you were seeing that term being taken up and the kind of genealogy of that term, because it's like right now so many folks in the theater world here in the city are using that as a framework to talk about like the labor conditions in theater. So I would love to hear how that kind of term and the use of that is, how that developed and how it's useful.
Great, okay.
Thank you so much. I wish I could see the whole thing. I got to watch the live stream. The conversation with her teacher later on and the idea of depicting and the universal makes me think of, and speaking of the Whitney, the depiction of Emmett Till by Dana Schutz, which was protested, I think rightly. Can you help me think through that and what Elizabeth Catlett might have said? I mean, she only died a couple of years before, I don't know, 2016 or something. She died in 2012, so had she lived, how do you think she would have thought through that controversy?
Okay, it's always the last question. Okay. Well, let me answer the first question first. Cultural worker, what's the genealogy? What are the debates behind it? There are a lot of debates. Very interesting debates in critical theory. What does it mean to add the word worker to cultural, which are interesting, and there's a specific genealogy. But what does it mean to think about those questions now in a gig economy, right? When we don't work, we don't labor, we're entrepreneurs, where you don't work, especially if you're an artist, for income, you do it for exposure, right? So what does it mean to bring in or to revitalize the language of cultural worker at this moment? I think it's really important. It's like what the grad students at UC Santa Cruz right now are doing. They're not getting educational experience by being TAs for different classes. They are workers. And by being on strike, they are demanding their rights as workers. So I'm in favor, of taking up those terms. They come very concretely from debates in the 1930s. So when I talk about cultural workers, I'm talking about WPA programs that subsidize artists as workers. And I think a lot of the cultural infrastructure that exists, that gets celebrated in the United States, is a product of those times when we took artists' work seriously as work. So I would be for revivifying that kind of language. I think the hour's too late, and it is inappropriate to try to bring Elizabeth Catlett back from the dead and tell you what she would have said about this, but I will tell you this, and I was going to include this in my presentation. I'm really sorry that I haven't. In 2002, Camille Cosby interviewed Catlett in a very extensive oral history that I only found a record of at the Library of Congress. So I'm going to tell you, I've been working on this damn project for a decade. As my advisor, Ruth Gilmore, knows, I had to travel all over the damn world. And then, like 5 years ago, everything got put online. So, great. Anyway, horrific for me, good for the rest of you, because it means that you can see Elizabeth Catlett think. And my favorite part of her interviews is that she's usually interviewed by a lot of liberals that don't know what they're dealing with. And in this interview in particular, the questions that get asked to her, you know, are these kind of leading questions. Well, you know, what is it, which I'm not going to impersonate, but she just bowls over the interviewer. And there's one particular exchange that I think is so important right now, which I think kind of reframed this whole project for me at this moment. In 2002, Catlett came to the US, and she said she was terrified by what she saw. She was terrified by the flag waving, by the jingoism, by the just, you know, vacuous move towards war. And so over the interviewer, who tries to steer her back and say, well, don't you want to talk about art? She says, this country is headed to fascism unless we develop a consciousness about our history and what's happening right now. So, you know, I won't bring Catlett back from the dead to answer your question, but I would really encourage you all, if you're compelled by any of the things I said, you know, I think a deep resuscitation of this woman, her legacy and her politics demand recovery, and I think it has quite a lot to say about our present moment.
Thanks very much for the talk. Thank you all very much for coming. It's really lovely to have you here. I want to invite you to join us for a reception. We have some snacks. I'm sure that Christina would be happy to take additional questions and we can get to know one another. So join me in thanking Christina once again.
Thank you, guys.